you know, and I think she more than justified.
The only woman I know who can spit on something.
Yeah, right. But anyway, that's about all I remember about it and so forth, except that it, you know, it had a very early James Bond kind of plot. You know, somebody trying to take over the world in a big way, and he was a mutant, you know, instead of and the X-Men were. They didn't spend much time in costume, you know, or anything like that. But then in between, the X-Men, when it was canceled under, say, like when Neil Adams and I had been doing it in the late '60s, and when one of the last decisions I made as editor-in-chief in '74 was to revive the X-Men as a new kind of group and so forth. In between there, you know, I had, by keeping them alive and so forth, I had a couple of writers, Conway and others, do stories with the X-Men in which they weren't in costume, because I thought they were so unique looking with wings and so forth that maybe it'd be interesting to go back to the idea Stan had for the Fantastic Four for the first couple of years, first couple of issues, I mean 2 issues, without costumes and so forth. And so but they did sort of eventually end up wearing the suits in the latter part, but you know, more these identical kind of costumes they had and so forth or whatever. But there were a lot of elements of the stories, and you know, people chasing Nightcrawler because they thought he was a demon. There were little things here and there that came from the comics. My idea of adapting comics, whether it's X-Men or Conan or anything else, is why, if something is right and you want to make it to a movie, I think it's quite often a fiction that you have to change things as much as the movies say you do. If it's really good, maybe you don't have to. Maybe you have to adjust it in some ways, but like Batman owes a lot to the comic, you know, and the Superman, and the Wonder Woman when it was on television, even the Hulk to a great extent. Underneath there, with all the surface details changed, the basis is really pretty similar. My favorite story about that is when they started to film the Hulk, I happened to know the assistant director out in Hollywood. I had just moved out there, and this was back in the middle '70s. And they were going to do the Hulk. And they had Lou Ferrigno lined up at it, also from Pumping Iron, you know. And they said, you should come by and see the makeup. You know, it's a nice shade of gray. And I said, what are you talking about, gray? You know, he's green. You know, this is before he was gray, you know, again. And they said, no, yeah, well, they decided that was too comic booky to have him green, so he was going to be gray. So I said, okay, listen, you know, it's Hollywood, what the hell. So a few weeks later, I saw the guy, and he says, why don't you come by and see a day of screening, of filming. So we did, and came by and watched him. He's beating on this iron lung thing and different things and so forth, you know. And it was fun for a few hours. And but the first thing I noticed when Ferrigno comes on the stage to be beating around and so forth, he's green. And so I called my friend, or I said, the assistant director, because he's pretty busy, didn't have his time. I said, he's green again. What happened? Oh, well, they kept working at different colors, and nothing else seemed right, so they just made him green. You know? and these people were all convinced like they had created this whole thing, you know. And Kenny Johnson, the very talented writer, producer, director of the Hulk movie, and who's gone, you know, has done quite a few other things. V, I think it's the word. He gave interviews that he said, well, you know, I just didn't pay attention to the comic book. I went to things like Frankenstein and Jekyll and Hyde. And I was thinking, what do you think Stan Lee and Jack Kirby went to in the first place? You know, I mean, these guys all have to think they have to reinvent the wheel every 3 days, that nobody else has ever done this before. I guess you need that in order to have the kind of ego to, you know, to carry a several million-dollar project through to the end, you know. Yes?
You can make a movie now from any character you've worked on. What one would you choose?
Well, it's very hard to think of because I haven't really, you know, had anybody ask me that, so therefore I haven't really thought about it. Of course, I'd still love to see a decent Conan movie made. You know, I'd like to see a decent Frankenstein movie made. I've never seen one. I mean, I'm a big fan of Karloff and those early movies, but they're not Frankenstein to me.
Oh, you must not have seen Frankenhooker then.
I missed Frankenhooker. The worst was Frankenstein, the true story. It seems like the more determined they are to say it's true, the farther they get away from the original. I can't claim to have seen everything that Frank's ever done, but I've never seen one that was my idea of Frankenstein, where they made a guy look like he was 8 feet tall and kind of gaunt and yellowy skinned, and he spoke eloquently, and except that he also could run at 40 or 50 miles an hour and so forth. And plus the other stuff, and set in the right period, 200 years ago. And until they do that, as far as I'm concerned, they haven't filmed Frankenstein. They've barely done Dracula, let alone Frankenstein. And what I'd really like to see is I'd like to see them done right. I mean, they only have a whole panel on that, and I'm not on it, and that's just as well. But I tried to interest people in doing some of these things, but my ideas of doing it is to maybe it's the old Classics Illustrated approach, but I just feel like if something's worth doing, sure, you have to make concessions. A movie is basically most of the time a short story or a novelette or a novella at the most, not a novel really. But the fact remains that you can cut out whatever you want to of it, but you still should try to leave as close as possible, you know. And in the case of the X-Men, we weren't allowed to because they wanted to use that group, so we had to, you know, ignore the earlier group. But whenever left to my own devices, you know, I'd like to, if you have a first-rate work in the first place, I'd like to stay as close to it as possible. I don't see any reason for all the changes in Conan, or Red Sonja for that matter. And the more prominent and the more established and really good and archetypal the image is in the first place, the less reason there is for changing it. But then what do I know? You know, I hated Batman, and that thing made hundreds of millions of dollars, you know. But at least it was somewhat close to Batman. Yes?
When you worked on the second movie, did you originally put Thelthamon in there? And if you did, how did you feel about the way they portrayed him? Because I did not like it.
Well, two parts of that. First of all, the closest thing to the first script we wrote, which is the one I remember the best, was we adapted into a graphic novel from Marvel a little later, and there's no Thelthamon in that. So I know he wasn't in the first draft. I think somewhere along the line, they wanted to bring in another sorcerer instead of what we had, just for a little bit. So we decided to make him the Stygian Thelthamon. Of course, we described a Stygian as to what a Stygian should look like. He's Egyptian. He's dusky, and he's this and he's that. By the time they got done, it's this little old guy with a white beard.
Well, he looked like,
you know, he was totally wrong.
From you know, Cyberpunk thing or something, because he had those ugly fingers.
Yeah. No, it was all wrong. But then again, that's because nobody, by that stage, nobody who was writing, producing, or directing the movie had probably, you know, if they'd read any Conan stories, it was only with a certain indifference ranging to contempt, probably.
When I heard them mention Thelthamon, I pictured him with the big
Yeah.
hand, with the big horn.
Yeah, well, that wouldn't have had to be, because that's as much as anything, I think, you know, Barry Smith's interpretation of the hat with the horns and things like that. Yeah. But I would have liked to have seen something, at least, that was a little closer to, you know, to the real Thelthamon. What we had wasn't Thelthamon exactly, but at least it was a little closer. At least he looked like a Stygian. He had an Egyptian kind of look to him, and he was a little grimmer. No, what I thought was in the movie, the only thing worse than that was this playing What's Behind the Window thing. Choose door. That was one thing that maybe the audiences think that I saw it with. I've only seen the movie once. I bought a tape, but I've never, you know, played it. God knows they weren't going to send me one free. You know, I've never been sent it. Every movie I've ever worked on, the 2 or 3 in Red Sonja that I was, you know, involved with, I've had to buy the tapes myself. You know, but I assure you that the thing about the door number 1 or 2 or 3 was not in any versions of our script. You know.
Well, what about using when they used Thulsa Doom for the first one?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's a call.
Yeah, they had special permission. I think that the lawyer, his name is Arthur Lieberman, who heads Conan Properties for DeCamp and Glenn and so forth, my understanding from him is that he talked them into using Thulsa Doom, as a name anyway, even though, of course, they didn't end up doing Thulsa Doom that looked anything like the character in the Cull, one or two Cull stories he was in. But the Thulsa Doom was put in because he wanted to push it in, because he was hoping to push the idea of them doing something later with Cull, you see. And they could only use it for that movie, and then it would come back so that Thulsa Doom could have become the villain in the Cull story. In other words, they don't have the right to use Conan, to use Thulsa Doom indefinitely. So it was an interesting ploy. But now, I guess at Marvel they have the rights, so I've just done the first story that I did for Savage Sword, which is a 4-part story that carries Conan to Australia, basically. Involves the first meeting, really, of Thulsa Doom and Thelthamon, you know, and in the comics, when Conan is in his late 30s and so forth. I thought it maybe was about time. You know, they were after me at Marvel to use a lot of special villains, and yeah, I'll be off in a few minutes. And use, you know, bring in, you know, special villains and things. And since I'm not the editor anymore, so okay, so I'll do it. So I figured, well, we'll use a little Thelthamon, as long as it doesn't violate what I, you know, what I really feel about the Conan comics, because the Conan comics are much closer, not 100%, but they're much closer to Robert E. Howard's life of Conan anyway, than the movies ever, you know, are ever likely to be. So we, but I figured, well, you know, Conan can't do a lot of encountering of Thulsa Doom too much, but by the time he's 40, he could have a little encounter with him. And Thulsa Doom, there's no problem. Besides, he has met him already in the color comic a couple of years ago. So, and I decided to sort of, you know, have him meet the two of them. We're going to, in Savage Sword, they decided they wanted to start having continuity. When I founded the magazine, I did it. I thought what I thought was fun was to jump around his life the same way Howard did when he wrote it, which also gave me a chance to adapt all the story without having to worry about it then being in order, because we already had the color comic that was proceeding on a very straight basis from him in his teens, and he aged about 10 years. In the 10 years I wrote the book, he aged 10 years, and therefore we could do all this other stuff. Nowadays we've gone through that. We've adapted everything by Howard and DeCamp and everything, even before I left. And they haven't adapted the Tor novels or other things, which don't really amount to too much anyway. And so now we have to do something new. So they decided they wanted another continuity. So I said, well, if Conan is about 27 or so in the color comic, let's make him around 10 years older in the black and white when he becomes a pirate. First a Moroccan pirate, then a Zingaran buccaneer. This gives him a chance to sail all over the place. So John Buscema and I have been working on that thing. So we've got, let's see, we just have time for just one or two more fast questions. If there's nothing else, we'll call it a day. We're talking more about the movies than about Conan as I know him, but that's okay, because I was involved with those. One last question real fast.
Since you said that you're going to make him older in the Savage Sword, is there any, have you got any ideas of adapting the last book of Conan of the Isles when he leaves after he's
Well, you're kind of behind the times, because first of all, I started out, that was the first third of Conan of the Isles was published as a Conan annual in the early 80s, and the other two were all written by me and drawn by John Buscema and just lay around on the shelf for almost 10 years. And about a couple of years ago, Craig Anderson, then the editor of some of the Conan materials, dragged out that old artwork and script and had it inked, and it's out as a graphic novel about 2 years ago. So it's been adapted. It's about a 60 or 70 page graphic novel. It came out fairly well, although I think the first third maybe was more successful because the last half of the lettering thing was rushed a little bit. And it's got a nice cover on it, and it's probably still available if you see it. There's no plans to do anything that's any later than that. We figure 70 is old enough. We'll leave it kind of vague because he was about to sail off for the New World. That seemed like a good point to leave him at.
He never said where he went.
Right. It'd be fun to do a sequel to that. I'd like to do the death of Conan sometime, but of course I think I'd like to make it my last Conan story if I ever did it. Anyway, well, thank you very much for your attention, and I hope I explained why it is that movies are so strange when you see them in there a little bit. It's the people that are making them are strange, the deals are strange, so the movies are going to be strange. Thank you.